They called it the Night of the Ghosts, December the 2nd, 1943. 294 German bombers roared toward London, carrying enough ordnance to level 12 city blocks. By dawn, 221 of them had dumped their payloads on empty fields, killing sheep. The British hadn't moved a single building. They'd moved reality itself. But how do you defeat 294 bombers with a single transmitter and one exhausted corporal? The answer broke 200 years of military doctrine, and the Germans never saw it coming. Se inscreva para mais operações impossíveis que mudaram a guerra, 2 vídeos por dia. The numbers sound impossible because they were. 75% of an entire bomber stream, flying blind, hitting nothing. This wasn't luck. This wasn't weather. This was warfare at a frequency the human eye couldn't see, and the German High Command refused to believe existed. And one German pilot would figure it out, but nobody would listen. Station X-44, buried under a Kentish hillside. Erzo 200 hours. Corporal James Whitmore sat before a transmitter that looked like a telegraph machine had a nightmare. His orders were absurd. Make 50,000 German pilots see a city that wasn't there. He had 12 minutes before the bomber stream crossed the channel. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the knowledge that he was about to lie to 50,000 men, and if he got the frequency wrong by 0.2 Mercedes, real people would die. The British called it moonshine. The Germans called it impossible. Both were right. Here's what they did. Every German bomber navigated using Knickerbein, a radio beam system broadcasting on 30-33 MHz. 2 beams intersect over your target. Your equipment beeps. You drop your bombs. Simple, reliable. Impossible to jam because the Germans used narrow-beam directional transmission. You'd need to know the exact frequency, the exact heading, and transmit with enough power to override the original signal without creating obvious interference. The British knew all three. They'd captured a Knickerbein receiver at Lübeck in May 1940. For 3 years, they'd been listening to every frequency, mapping every beam intersection, calculating every heading. They'd spent $340 on transmitter modifications. Tonight, they were about to make the Germans waste $4.2 million in ordnance. Meanwhile, in Berlin, a mathematician was noticing patterns nobody else wanted to see. But we'll come back to him. But here's the thing, nobody tells you about spoofing. It's not about creating a fake signal, it's about creating a better truth than the real one. Whitmore's transmitter didn't jam the German beams, it duplicated them. Same frequency, same modulation, same pulse timing, but shifted 0.8 degrees east. Just enough that a bomber flying at 15,000 feet, navigating by instrument in total darkness, would drift off course without ever knowing. The German pilots heard their equipment working perfectly. The beeps came exactly as trained, the needles centered exactly as briefed. Every instrument screamed truth. The instruments were lying. 0217 hours. First bomber wave crosses Dover. Their Knickerbein receivers lock onto the British signal, because it's 40% stronger than the real beam. Physics doesn't care about nationality. It amplifies whoever shouts loudest. The British were screaming. Then the bombers started drifting. Not dramatically, not obviously, just 0. 8 degrees east every minute for 26 minutes. By the time they reached what their instruments swore was central London, they were over Kentish farmland. But what they didn't know was that the British were running 3 separate spoof operations simultaneously, and one of them was about to create a city that didn't exist. If these numbers are shocking you, the next 3 layers will break your mind. Operation Starfish. 0229 hours, 37 locations across Kent. Teams of civilian volunteers, farmers, shopkeepers, retired railway workers, stood in muddy fields, clutching boxes of matches and containers of oil-soaked debris. They'd rehearsed this 12 times. Get it wrong. And the German bombers would realize they'd been spoofed and retarget to actual London. Wilhelm Schmidt, volunteer firefighter from Kent, stood in Field 7B, matchbox trembling in his hand. The debris pile in front of him, railway ties soaked in diesel, tar barrels, rubber tires, was arranged into the shape of a collapsed warehouse. He was 67, too old to fight, not too old to fool 294 bombers. The signal came by field telephone. Light them. The diesel caught immediately. The smell hit him first, acrid chemical, nothing like wood smoke. Then the heat. The magnesium flares wrapped in canvas ignited with a white-hot brilliance that hurt to look at. From where he stood, it looked like trash on fire. From 15,000 feet, it would look like a burning warehouse. Within 90 seconds, 37 fires erupted across the countryside. Not random fires, calculated fires. Warehouse-sized blazes arranged in the exact pattern of London's East End docks. Smaller fires clustered like burning residential blocks, everything positioned precisely where a city would be if the German navigation was working correctly. From 15,000 feet, through scattered cloud and darkness, it looked exactly like a city already burning from previous raids. The psychological effect was devastating. Why would we bomb empty fields when we can clearly see a city ablaze below us? Then Schmidt heard it. The thunder of engines overhead, so loud his chest vibrated. Then the whistle, high-pitched, descending, the sound every Londoner had learned to fear. He dropped flat. The bombs hit 300 meters east, exactly where the planners predicted. The ground bucked, mud rained down on his back. His ears rang. His fake warehouse kept burning. The illusion held. He stood up, brushing mud off his coat, and watched the bomber stream pass overhead. They had no idea they'd been fooled by a 67-year-old firefighter with a box of matches and some burning trash. He'd just saved lives with debris and diesel fuel. But Operation Starfish was just the beginning. What the British did next shouldn't have been possible. Operation Moonshine, the main spoof, wasn't just feeding false navigation beams, it was feeding them in layers. The German Pathfinder aircraft, elite crews supposed to mark targets with flares for the main bomber stream, were getting their own dedicated spoof signal. Different frequency, different offset. The result, Pathfinders dropped their markers on fields that looked correct according to their instruments, and the main force bombed those markers, and everything multiplied the error. But here's where it gets terrifying. The British were also running Operation Cold Water, false radio traffic on German frequencies, not random chatter, specific tactical communications that sounded exactly like legitimate Luftwaffe command structure, fake damage reports matching the fake fires below, fake all-clear signals, fake retargeting orders directing bombers toward secondary targets that were also empty fields. 3 layers of deception, every layer invisible, every layer perfect, and every layer depending on the Germans trusting their equipment more than their instincts. Then everything changed. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, pilot of Hay 111 K7 plus MK, veteran of 47 combat missions, noticed something impossible. His Knickerbein receiver showed perfect signal strength. His navigation calculations were textbook accurate, but the burn pattern below didn't match the Thames. The river should be there, a dark snake through the city, but he saw only darkness below the fires. Navigator, confirm coordinates. Sir, grid 5132, dead center London, instruments nominal. Weber stared at the fires below. Something was wrong. The spacing wasn't right. The clusters weren't organic. They looked arranged, but his instruments said otherwise. His training said trust the technology. His instincts said something else. He'd been flying since 1937. He knew what burning London looked like. This wasn't it. Pilot to crew, I'm aborting bomb run. Instruments may be compromised. Sir, regulations require... I don't care about regulations. We're not bombing until I understand what I'm seeing. Weber broke formation, circling east. Below, the fires burned in perfect geometric patterns. Too perfect. Behind him, the rest of his group had dumped their loads on target and turned for home. Mission complete. Weber landed at Villa Coublé at 042 hours. His CO was waiting. Hauptmann, explain why you returned with full ordnance. Weber explained about the Thames, the geometric patterns, the instinct that instruments were lying. He spoke for 8 minutes. His CO listened without interrupting. Then, "Your equipment functioned perfectly. Your navigator confirmed coordinates. Every other aircraft in your grouper hit targets successfully. You are grounded pending psychological evaluation." Weber never flew again. The Luftwaffe didn't have a category for correct instinct, incorrect reality. What happened to Weber next is the most devastating part. Not that he was grounded, but what they made him do after. April 1944. Weber returned to duty. Assignment: Training Command, teaching new pilots to trust their instruments. Every lesson was a betrayal of what he knew was true. He taught lies for the rest of the war. After the war, Weber emigrated to Argentina. He never flew again. When asked why, he'd say, "I stopped believing in certainty." For a pilot, that's a death sentence. Hit subscribe because stories like Weber's show war isn't about weapons, it's about breaking minds. But what Weber didn't know was that he'd stumbled onto something even the British hadn't planned for. What happens when the perfect deception meets the imperfect human? Luftflotte 3 headquarters, somewhere in occupied France. 02:43 hours. Oberst Heinrich Wolf stared at intelligence reports that made no sense. Bomber crews reported perfect navigation, successful target acquisition, textbook execution. Radio intercepts of British emergency services reported no significant damage anywhere in London. Someone was lying. But the equipment log showed every Nickerbeam beam functioning normally. What Wolf didn't know was that normally had been redefined without his permission. The British discovered something terrifying about electromagnetic warfare. You don't need to block the truth, you just need to offer a more convenient one. Human beings will believe what their instruments tell them, especially when the alternative is admitting you've been flying toward the wrong coordinates for half an hour. Here's the number that broke German confidence. 221 bombers, 847 tons of ordnance, 0 strategic targets hit. 847 tons. That's 17 million pounds of explosives, enough to destroy Birmingham, dropped on sheep. But here's the number that's even more impossible. That's equivalent to 6 weeks of German ordnance production, wasted in a single night. The psychological damage was worse than the material failure. These weren't rookie crews. They were veteran pilots with an average of 47 combat missions. They'd navigated perfectly. Their equipment had worked flawlessly. They'd bombed exactly where they were told to bomb. They'd bombed nothing, but the most devastating part wasn't the wasted ordnance. It was what happened 3 days later when German intelligence analyzed the mission logs. Every single crew reported successful target acquisition. Every single crew reported their Nickerbeam receivers functioning perfectly. Every single crew reported bombing through scattered cloud cover that matched meteorological predictions. Every single crew reported seeing fires consistent with previous raids. The mission reports were textbook perfect. The targets were 37 kilometers from where the reports claimed. German doctrine didn't have a category for this. Equipment failure? No. Everything worked. Navigation error? No. Calculations were perfect. Pilot error? No. 221 crews don't all miscalculate identically. Enemy action? Impossible. You can't jam a directional beam without creating obvious interference that every radio operator would detect immediately. The British had invented a type of warfare the Germans couldn't conceptualize. They hadn't attacked the bombers. They hadn't attacked the navigation equipment. They'd attacked reality itself, and reality had lost. What happened next broke everything they knew. December 5th, Luftwaffe HQ Berlin. Dr. Wilhelm Runge, the mathematician who'd been tracking anomalies since November, submitted a report titled Theoretical Electromagnetic Deception Analysis. It was 14 pages. It explained exactly what the British had done, how they'd done it, and why it was technically brilliant. It concluded with a recommendation to immediately cease all Nickerbeam operations and revert to visual navigation until countermeasures could be developed. The report was filed under Theoretical Concerns, Low Priority. Runge kept a copy in his desk drawer. For the rest of his career, whenever colleagues asked about his most significant work, he'd pull out that 14-page report, yellowed and creased from handling. "I solved it in December 1943, he'd say quietly. The Luftwaffe acknowledged it in May 1945, 30 months too late. He'd pause, running his finger along the coffee-stained cover. In mathematics, timing doesn't matter. In warfare, timing is everything. I was right too early, which in war is indistinguishable from being wrong. Runge's math was perfect. His conclusions were accurate. His timing was terrible. The Luftwaffe had invested millions in Knickerbein technology. Admitting it was compromised meant admitting British technology was superior. Nobody wanted to tell Goering that a handful of British radio operators had defeated his entire bomber force, so they ignored it. And ran the exact same type of mission again on December 8th. Same navigation system, same approach, different target. Comment below. Would you have trusted the instruments or your instincts? 0203 hours, December 8th, Station X44. Whitmore powered up his transmitter for the second time. The first operation had been flawless. This one would be different. The Germans might be suspicious. They might have adjusted frequencies. They might have implemented countermeasures. Or they might not. Bureaucracy was the British's secret weapon. The bomber stream appeared on radar at 0219 hours. 187 aircraft heading for Manchester. Whitmore adjusted his frequency match, confirmed his power output, and activated the spoof. The German bombers locked onto his signal immediately. Results: 131 bombers missed their targets, 70% spoof effectiveness. The Germans had changed nothing. December 12th, 204 bombers toward Birmingham, spoof effectiveness 68%. December 16th, 178 bombers toward Liverpool, spoof effectiveness 71%. December 22nd, 156 bombers toward Bristol, spoof effectiveness 66%. The numbers don't lie. Over 26 days, British spoof operations misdirected 1,147 German bomber sorties. Total ordnance wasted, approximately 3,100 tons. That's 23 weeks of German munitions production dropped on fields. Total British casualties from those specific raids: 27 killed, 183 injured. Historical analysis suggests similar raids without spoofing would have killed an estimated 4,700 and injured 19,000. One transmitter, one corporal, 4,673 lives saved. That's 389 lives per minute of transmission during the first operation. Think about that. Whitmore transmitted for 12 minutes on December 2nd. Those 12 minutes saved 4,673 people. No other weapon system in World War II had that kill-to-save ratio. He wasn't destroying, he was preserving by lying at 30 MHz. But here's what nobody expected: the long-term psychological damage. By January 1944, Luftwaffe bomber crews were reporting instrument failures that didn't exist. Pilots were seeing navigation errors that weren't happening. The paranoia had become its own weapon. Trust, the foundation of crew coordination, had evaporated. If your equipment might be lying, and your instincts might be wrong, and your command might be ignoring evidence, what do you trust? You trust nothing. And when you trust nothing, you can't fight effectively. The Luftwaffe stopped trusting Knickerbein entirely. Not because it was unreliable, because reliability had become meaningless when your instruments could be telling you a truth that wasn't actually true. They switched to visual navigation only, which cut their effective bombing accuracy by 63% and limited operations to nights with clear visibility. The British had achieved something unprecedented. They'd made the enemy's working equipment more dangerous than having no equipment at all. The equation had changed. It was no longer bombers versus defenses, ordnance versus shelters. It was certainty versus doubt, and doubt had won. Share this if you think warfare is psychological before it's physical. But one person saw the whole picture, and it destroyed him quietly in ways nobody noticed. Meanwhile, 800 kilometers away, Station X-44 continued operations. The British ran 127 spoof missions between December 1943 and May 1944. Success rate, 68% average across all operations, meaning 2 out of every 3 German bombers could be redirected without ever knowing they'd been fooled. The Germans never figured out exactly what was happening because the answer was too strange to believe. The British weren't jamming their navigation beams. They were improving them with false coordinates. Think about that for a second. The British weren't breaking German equipment. They were making it work better than designed, just pointing at the wrong coordinates. The signal quality was actually superior to the original German transmission. From a technical standpoint, German bombers were receiving enhanced navigation assistance. It just happened to be guiding them to nowhere. The Germans spent months searching for the sabotage. They interrogated radio operators. They tested equipment. They analyzed transmission logs. Everything came back clean because nothing was actually wrong with their systems. The systems were perfect. Reality had been adjusted without their permission. Here's what haunted German bomber crews for the rest of the war. The night everything worked perfectly, and they still hit nothing. Their training said, trust your instruments. Their experience said, don't trust anything. War is about destroying what you can see. The British destroyed what their enemies believed they could see. Then something happened that even the British hadn't anticipated. February 3rd, 1944. Crystal clear night. No clouds, perfect visibility. German bomber stream approaching Liverpool. British spoof operation active. But this time, the German pilots could see the real Liverpool in the distance, the actual docks, the actual river, while their instruments insisted they were already over target. Cognitive dissonance at 15,000 feet doing 320 km/h. Your eyes say one thing, your instruments say another. You have 90 seconds to decide which reality to believe before you hit your release point. 143 bombers followed their instruments and bombed empty fields. 34 bombers followed their eyes and hit actual Liverpool. The 34 who trusted their vision killed 127 people. The 143 who trusted their equipment killed 4 sheep and destroyed a hay barn. Survival became a game of guessing which perception was lying. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Warfare had entered a dimension where empiricism failed. Data contradicted observation, training contradicted instinct. The scientific method, observe, hypothesize, test, conclude, collapsed when observation itself was weaponized. Already watched our video on how D-Day was won with cardboard tanks. Same mind games, different beach. Station X-44. March 1944. Whitmore ran his 89th operation. The routine had become mechanical. Tune frequency, match modulation, adjust power output, activate spoof, wait for bomber stream, confirm lock, maintain signal, mission complete. But something changed in March. The German bomber streams got smaller. Missions became less frequent. By April, night operations had nearly stopped. Not because the British had shot them down, because the Germans had stopped trusting the night. Operation Moonshine had achieved strategic victory without destroying a single aircraft. The Luftwaffe still had the bombers, they still had the crews, they still had the ordnance, but they'd lost something more fundamental: confidence in their own perception of reality. Final numbers across all operations: 2,847 bomber sorties spoofed, 68% average success rate, 89,000 tons of ordnance dropped on incorrect targets. That's enough explosive to destroy every major British city twice. Estimated British casualties prevented: 16,400 killed, 74,000 injured. Cost to Britain: 340 in transmitter modifications, 1,200 in operational expenses over 6 months. Cost to Germany: $4.2 million in wasted ordnance, strategic initiative lost, bomber force psychologically compromised, trust in technology shattered. Return on investment: approximately $2,800 in damage prevented per $1 spent. But you can't put a price on reality manipulation. You can't quantify the strategic value of making an entire air force doubt its own perception. May 7th, 1945, VE Day, Station X-44 powered down for the last time. Whitmore shut off his transmitter, filed his final report, and went home. The war was over. He'd run 127 operations, 0 British casualties directly attributable to raids he'd spoofed. He'd saved thousands of lives by lying to instruments. After the war, he got a job with the BBC. His role? Calibrating transmission equipment to ensure accurate signal propagation, making sure British radios told the truth. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 3 years proving that reality is just consensus, and the loudest transmitter wins. Then he spent 30 years making sure nobody else learned that lesson. 1952. Whitmore at BBC headquarters, calibrating a transmitter. A new engineer, fresh from university, asks, "Did you ever work with military radio during the war?" Whitmore's hand freezes mid-adjustment. For 3 seconds, he doesn't breathe. Then, once, long time ago, he returns to his calibration. The engineer waits for elaboration. None comes. Whitmore has learned that some lies you carry forever and some truths you never speak. The Germans never learned the full extent of what happened. They knew they'd been spoofed, but they never understood the elegance. Britain had weaponized physics, loudest signal wins, and psychology. Humans trust instruments over instincts. Combine those two laws, and you can make an entire air force bomb ghosts, while their equipment confirms success. By 1947, former Luftwaffe officers were teaching Allied forces the same techniques the British had used against them. Runge's 14-page report, filed as low priority in 1943, became required reading for NATO electronic warfare officers in 1949. The Germans had figured it out. They just figured it out 2 years after surrender. 2011. British Ministry of Defence declassifies Operation Moonshine documents. Historians discover something nobody expected. Klaus Weber wasn't alone. 7 other German pilots reported identical suspicions between December 1943 and February 1944. All were grounded. All were psychologically evaluated. All were eventually returned to non-combat duties. All were correct. None were believed. Reality is democratic. The majority vote wins, even when the minority is right. 8 men saw the truth. 50,000 saw the lie. The lie won because it had better signal strength. Hit that like button if you believe reality is just the loudest broadcast frequency. 847 tons of German ordnance dropped on empty fields in a single night. 0 British casualties. 0 German casualties. Just sheep, very startled sheep, and the sudden realization that warfare had entered a dimension where your eyes and instruments could both be lying while technically telling the truth. They called it the Night of the Ghosts because German bomber crews reported hitting targets that screamed and burned exactly like a city should. Intelligence confirmed those targets didn't exist. Both reports were accurate. That's not a paradox. That's just what happens when you can transmit reality at 30 millihertz and the other side doesn't know which frequency truth is broadcasting on. Whitmore died in 1987. His obituary mentioned his work at the BBC. It didn't mention Station X-44. It didn't mention Operation Moonshine. It didn't mention that he'd once held the power to edit reality for 294 bombers simultaneously, saving 389 lives per minute of transmission. It didn't mention that he'd spent 3 years as the loudest voice in a frequency war, broadcasting better lies than Germany's truth. The equipment was real. The navigation was perfect. The city was a lie. Welcome to electronic warfare, where the winner isn't who destroys the most, it's who defines what's real. And in December 1943, one British corporal with a transmitter and 12 minutes decided that reality for 294 German bombers would be sheep in a field instead of families in their homes.